Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal after countless days of emotional chaos, explosive secrets, and legal warfare over custody battles that tore through families and relationships, a rare moment of peace finally fell upon Port Charles like a soft whisper of hope. In the sterile stillness of the hospital room, that quiet was broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of a newborn, a girl named Daisy, the tiny yet powerful symbol of a new beginning. Sasha had given birth safely, her face pale but radiant, her eyes brimming with the tears of someone who had walked through fire and emerged, if not unscathed, then undeniably alive. Daisy, swaddled in hospital linen and nestled against her mother's chest, bore the innocence of a child untouched by the betrayal, manipulation, and grief that had surrounded her arrival. The name Sasha had chosen, simple, fresh, and rooted in nature, was no accident. It reflected her desperate wish for something pure, something real, after so long drowning in a sea of deception and trauma. Michael stood beside Sasha, silent but overwhelmed by emotion, his hands slightly trembling as he reached out to gently stroke his daughter's cheek. His eyes shimmered with a pride he no longer tried to hide. The truth about his paternity, once concealed for the sake of strategy and fear, had been unveiled to the entire town in the most dramatic of courtroom revelations. Yet, in that quiet moment in the hospital, none of that mattered. Not the gossip. Not the judgment. Not even the fallout. What mattered was the life that now existed because of a love he and Sasha once tried to bury. Daisy was a living testament to that love, bruised, complicated, and chaotic though it may have been, and Michael could not deny the overwhelming sense of belonging that came from holding her, from seeing her tiny fingers curl around his thumb. Willow stood in the corner of the room, her presence soft and unobtrusive, like a ghost from a different chapter of Michael's life. She had come to support Sasha, or so she told herself. But as her gaze locked onto the scene unfolding before her, Michael at Sasha's side, the baby nestled between them, she felt a sharp tug in her chest, a reminder of what once was and what might never be again. Though her heart had fractured under the weight of Michael's betrayal, in that moment, she found herself smiling. It was a small, bittersweet smile, born from both heartbreak and healing. Because in that tiny, sleeping face was something neither Michael nor Sasha could ever fake, unconditional love, the kind that should rise above resentment and rivalry. Willow understood, perhaps more than anyone else, the sanctity of family and the instinctive pull of a parent toward their child. And as much as it pained her, she couldn't deny that what she saw before her was real, and maybe even beautiful. But even as serenity blossomed in that small hospital room, a storm was gathering just outside. Drew stood beyond the windowpane, his face a mask of cold restraint, but inside he was unraveling. Watching Michael and Willow exchange the kind of smile they once reserved for each other pierced him in a way he hadn't anticipated. There was Daisy, the newborn he had hoped would only further complicate Michael's life, instead becoming the very thing binding him closer to both Sasha and Willow. And there was Willow, his partner, his supposed ally in the crusade against Michael, gazing at her ex-husband with a softness that Drew hadn't seen in weeks. In that frozen moment, Drew realized he was not only losing the custody battle but also losing Willow's heart. But the most devastating blow to Drew hadn't come from a look or a smile. It came in the form of truth, a truth he had fought to bury. The secret he carried, the scheme he had orchestrated in Germany to frame Michael and tilt the custody war in his favor, had begun to unravel. What had once seemed airtight, bribes paid to hotel staff, falsified check-in times, doctor testimonies, was now falling apart under the weight of its own corruption. A hotel receptionist, scared and guilt-ridden, had come forward anonymously. A security tape had resurfaced, contradicting the narrative Drew had worked so hard to control. Worse yet, a leaked audio recording captured him negotiating payment in hushed tones, his voice unmistakable. Whispers spread like wildfire through Port Charles, turning suspicion into certainty. Drew hadn't just tried to manipulate the legal system, he had committed a calculated, felonious betrayal. Cornered and spiraling, Drew's thoughts turned dark. He couldn't afford to let Sasha's triumph become permanent. In his mind, she had become the catalyst for his unraveling. If she hadn't revealed the truth about Daisy's paternity, if she hadn't testified so candidly under Rick Lansing's piercing cross-examination, then the fragile narrative he had built might have held. But Sasha, with her broken honesty and quiet strength, had undone him. So Drew made a choice. Not to retreat. Not to confess. But to retaliate. He launched a covert smear campaign, dredging up Sasha's past, her public breakdowns, her battles with addiction, her time in Ferncliff, and painted them as signs of mental instability. He reached out to a former psychiatrist, offering incentives in exchange for exaggerated diagnoses. He hired a crisis PR firm to subtly distribute fabricated documents, painting Sasha as a danger to her own child. He drafted legal motions that demanded emergency supervision for Daisy, citing Sasha's instability as a threat to the baby's well-being. Quietly but relentlessly, he prepared to have Sasha declared unfit, all while hiding behind a carefully curated image of the wronged man trying to protect a child from chaos. But what Drew didn't account for was the strength Sasha had forged from her pain. This wasn't the same woman who had once been manipulated by Cyrus, who had nearly lost herself after Brando's death. This was a mother now, and she had fire in her veins. Supported by Michael, shielded by Carly, defended by Jason, and empowered by the unconditional love of her newborn daughter, Sasha was no longer fighting to survive, she was fighting to win. She and Michael began to quietly gather evidence against Drew, working with Jason to trace wire transfers and subpoena hotel records from Germany. Carly leveraged her contacts to initiate a counter-narrative, one that painted Sasha not as a victim but as a warrior, a woman who had been attacked but never broken. As Daisy slept soundly in her mother's arms, the city outside held its breath. The battle for justice was far from over, but for the first time in months, the playing field felt level. Sasha had given birth to more than a baby, she had given birth to a new chapter. One where truth stood a chance, where lies had consequences, and where the light of a child named Daisy could shine through even the darkest legacies. And though Drew's vengeance might not yet be finished, it was no longer uncontested. Because now, Sasha wasn't standing alone. And in Port Charles, that meant everything. Sasha, once adrift in the wreckage of her own traumas, now found herself navigating an entirely different storm. Not one born from personal loss or emotional collapse, but from the calculated wrath of a man scorned. Motherhood had brought a light into her life that she had never thought possible again, a sense of purpose so profound it seemed to chase away even the darkest memories of Brando's death and her descent into grief. Daisy was more than just her daughter. She was a rebirth, a reason to fight, and a fragile symbol of peace that Sasha was determined to protect at all costs. But that serenity was under constant threat. Hovering above every moment of joy was the gathering storm of Drew's fury, silent, methodical, and increasingly dangerous. While the rest of Port Charles celebrated the birth of a child and the quiet mending of fractured bonds, Drew was plotting in the shadows, and Sasha knew the storm was coming for her. Jason had been the first to sound the alarm. Ever the observer, ever the sentinel, he had picked up on subtle movements, vague threats, and whispered alliances that all pointed to Drew preparing his next move. It was Jason who came to Michael, not with panic, but with a level-headed warning. Drew was not backing down. He was regrouping. That was all Michael needed to hear. With an urgency born of both love and fear, Michael sprang into action. Without making a show of it, he quietly installed a state-of-the-art security system around Sasha's home, motion sensors, surveillance cameras, remote alarms. He made sure her address was confidential, her legal documents in order, and her communications secure. He didn't want to scare her, but he refused to leave her and their daughter vulnerable for even a second. He also contacted a high-powered attorney specializing in privacy law and custody defense, someone who owed a favor to Carly and who had a reputation for turning legal ambushes into courtroom annihilations. Michael was preparing for every possible scenario, not just restraining orders, but injunctions, emergency custody filings, character assassination lawsuits. He was building a legal fortress around Sasha and Daisy, one that Drew would not breach without consequences. Carly, seeing all of this unfold, found herself in a position she had not anticipated, defending the very woman who had once complicated her family's structure. But her instincts, always sharp and rarely wrong, told her this wasn't about loyalty to Sasha. It was about protecting a child, her granddaughter. Carly had always been a fierce protector, and now, with Daisy in the picture, her claws were out. She made herself available to Sasha in a way that was unfamiliar but deeply needed. No judgment, no veiled warnings, no cold glares, just quiet support. She showed up with food when Sasha was too exhausted to cook, held Daisy so Sasha could sleep, and even stayed silent during the nights when Sasha wept without explanation. Carly, who had seen more life and death than most, understood that Daisy wasn't just Sasha's daughter. She was the manifestation of survival, of love redefined, of a second chance that rarely came to people like them. She saw in Sasha what few others could, a woman clawing her way back from the abyss, one heartbeat at a time. But Drew was not idle. While the rest of them built defenses, he built illusions. He began feeding anonymous tips to local gossip sites, carefully orchestrating leaks that painted Sasha as unstable and emotionally volatile. Stories surfaced about her past, the breakdowns, the drugs, the delusions. Old photos were manipulated to look recent, casting doubt on her current mental state. A medical report, once confidential, found its way into a family court discussion board, suggesting that Sasha had been under psychiatric evaluation just months before Daisy's birth. All of it framed perfectly, not too overt to be dismissed as slander, but just believable enough to stoke suspicion. Drew wore the mask of the wounded lover, the concerned co-parent, the man desperate to shield a child from chaos. The town, ever hungry for scandal, began whispering. Was Sasha really stable? Was Daisy safe? Was Michael being manipulated again by a woman who had a history of spiraling under pressure? Drew let those questions fester like poison in the water supply, never confirming, never denying, just allowing doubt to grow. But the truth was far more insidious. Drew wasn't trying to protect anyone. He was trying to destroy, not just Sasha's credibility, but her sense of self, her ability to mother, to love, to exist without fear. The farther he sank into this vendetta, the less he resembled the man Willow once trusted. He wasn't fighting for family anymore. He was fighting to dominate, to humiliate, to avenge a fantasy of control that had slipped beyond his reach. Jason, meanwhile, had embraced his role as Daisy's godfather with a stoic devotion that only he could bring. He didn't make grand gestures or loud declarations. He simply watched, listened, and waited. When Sasha asked him to be part of Daisy's life, she had meant it as a symbolic gesture. But for Jason, it was a vow. He kept close tabs on Drew's movements, quietly gathering evidence, documenting inconsistencies in the narrative Drew was spreading. He coordinated with Michael's attorney, offered Sasha a safe house should things escalate, and maintained a presence that was both silent and formidable. People knew, Jason was watching, and that alone made Drew think twice. Sasha, slowly recovering from childbirth while trying to hold her world together, began to see the pattern forming. She recognized the shift in energy, the looks in public, the way conversations quieted when she walked into a room, the sudden reluctance of old acquaintances to return her calls. She wasn't paranoid. She was being targeted. But this time, she wouldn't collapse. She wouldn't run. Because now, she wasn't fighting for herself, she was fighting for Daisy. Every sleepless night, every drop of milk, every diaper changed in exhaustion was an act of defiance against the narrative Drew tried to spin. She would not be the woman he described. She would be better. Stronger. And Carly, who had once been the gatekeeper to Michael's world, now opened the door for Sasha instead. One afternoon, Sasha placed Daisy into Carly's arms. It was unspoken, but in that moment, something shifted between them. Carly cradled the baby as though she were her own, her eyes softening with a depth that came from understanding loss, pain, and resilience. She whispered nothing, just held the child and nodded, a silent promise that whatever came next, Daisy would not stand alone. In this new chapter, alliances were being redrawn, and battle lines redefined. Drew was still out there, his plans unfinished, but the tide was turning. Sasha had found her strength. Michael had found his purpose. Jason had found his mission. And Carly had rediscovered her maternal instinct in the eyes of a child who represented everything fragile and everything worth fighting for. Daisy had become more than a baby. She was now the reason for redemption, the anchor in a storm, the flickering flame around which a fractured family was beginning to rebuild. And as the shadows loomed closer, Sasha stood tall, no longer afraid, no longer alone, but fierce and ready. The moment Wiley and Amelia arrived to meet their newborn sister, accompanied by Willow, the hospital room was momentarily transformed into something strikingly close to a family portrait. Daisy slept peacefully in Sasha's arms, while Michael gently guided the older children toward the bassinet, encouraging them to say hello to their baby sister. Willow stood slightly apart, her posture calm, her expression unreadable as she watched Michael interact with their children, his face lit up with a joy she hadn't seen in him for quite some time. The atmosphere might have felt whole to the untrained eye, even warm, but just outside, standing at a distance near the hallway, was Drew. His presence was as cold as it was silent, his eyes fixed on the scene through the glass, jaw clenched, hands tightly balled into fists. It was a reminder to everyone that whatever peace they were attempting to grasp was fragile and temporary. Willow, though saying nothing, could feel the sharp tension thickening around them. She wasn't naive to the danger. She sensed it in the air, in the way Drew's shadow loomed without movement. Yet, instead of retreating, she chose stillness, a purposeful kind of watching, as though she were waiting for the truth to crack open once more, for clarity to rise from the chaos. Deep down, perhaps she wasn't sure whether the flicker she felt in her chest as she exchanged glances with Michael was a sign of rekindled love or merely the final echo of a memory fading away in slow, painful increments. For Sasha, the convergence of everyone she once feared losing into one room stirred a storm of emotions beneath the surface, but she remained unwavering. She understood now, with absolute clarity, that her strength didn't lie in pretending everything was under control, but in accepting the messiness of love, motherhood, and survival. The baby in her arms was more than a reason to go on. Daisy was the center of her universe, the undeniable force anchoring her against the pull of despair. She knew Drew was powerful. He had influence, wealth, connections, and a dangerous blend of resentment and cunning that made him unpredictable. But Sasha had something he could never take from her, a reason worth fighting for. And that changed everything. She no longer approached her battles with the desperation of a woman cornered, but with the resolve of a mother protecting her child. Her love for Daisy made her fierce. Her mistakes made her human. And her hope, fragile yet unshaken, made her unstoppable. She would not back down, no matter how many motions Drew filed or how many rumors he seeded into the press. The war might be fought in courtrooms and public opinion, but Sasha would be ready on every front. And if Drew dared go further, if he crossed the line and tried to destroy not just her reputation but her family, she would do what she had never imagined herself doing again. She would rise and protect Michael too. For all the pain, for all the separation, she could not forget that this man had stood by her in the delivery room, had held her hand through labor, and had gazed at their daughter with tears in his eyes. That meant something. Maybe everything. Sasha knew the kind of man Michael could be, loyal, passionate, flawed, but deeply devoted. If Drew continued to lash out, threatening not just Daisy's future but the fragile trust beginning to form again between her and Michael, then Sasha wouldn't hesitate to stand between them. She was no longer the frightened woman who had once walked away, believing she wasn't strong enough to hold on to love. She was a mother now. She was whole in ways she had never been before. And even if the world turned against her again, she would not flinch. Not with Daisy in her arms. Not with truth on her side. And not with the quiet hope that, somehow, this time, the family she had longed for might finally be within reach.